Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please, and what first drew you to Mary Wollstonecraft?
So Ellen, it's a great story actually, and thank you so much for asking me. I always love to tell it. What it is that I've lived in this area for over 35 years, and I brought up a family. So when my kids were at primary school, which was on Newington Green, the librarian there said to me that she'd found this local history book, which was by Pat Haynes, and it was all about the history of Newington Green. And in it, there's a beautiful piece written by Pat Haynes about Mary Wollstonecraft and the life that she led and the school that she ran on Newington Green. And I'm a feminist and I'm a performance maker. And I just thought, well, this is a wonderful story and I really want to know more. What it was that I did have the book by Claire Tomlin at home, the biography of Mary Wollstonecraft, and my mother had that because my mother's a feminist, and I hadn't read it. I mean, if you open it, you just go, oh, right, okay, no, I don't think so. But I have always loved theatre because I find it's a really good way to understand research and to understand stuff on the written page in a little bit more accessible form than long form narrative. So I'm really interested in the way that dialogue is cut up for theatre and scripts, really. So I'm also very interested in fragments. So what I did was I commissioned a play to be written about the life and times of Mary Wollstonecraft on Newington Green.
Speaking about Newington Green,
Yeah.
You're involved in Mary on the Green's campaign to erect a statue, the first memorial sculpture to Mary Wollstonecraft.
That's right. And this campaign has been going on for over 10 years. I'm just talking to one of the founders, Nikki Southern, who actually had the name Mary on the Green. She coined that name. It's quite important to say that because I'm very keen on legacy and archive and the fact that even our legacies and they get erased in the way that Mary Wollstonecraft's did. So it seems appropriate to have a proper memorial to Mary on the Green. And we've been raising that funding from a lot of local donations. But recently we had a West End theatre show called Amazon Stepped Out, which was written by the chair of Newington Green Action of Mary on the Green, called B. Rowlatt. Now, B wrote this wonderful play, but on the same evening, Jude Kelly, who used to run the South Bank Centre, who's our patron, made an announcement to say that we're over the line. We have the 145,000 that it takes to commission Maggie Hambling, the contemporary artist Maggie Hambling, to create this beautiful memorial to Mary Wollstonecraft. So that memorial is a lost wax process. It's 10 foot. There's a plinth and then a 7-foot memorial. And what's great about it is that it's in silver, so it represents all women, and we're all represented by being mirrored in this silver memorial. And it builds one woman on top of each other. So it's very mother and daughter, and obviously Wollstonecraft was the mother of Mary Shelley. But it's also got great sort of natural characteristics. It's very organic, but it's also very much about the sea, and it's very lively. So it speaks to Wollstonecraft as a radical, to the first woman travel writer. And the quote on the plinth says, in Wollstonecraft's words from Vindication, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." So early summer 2020, we should be unveiling the memorial on Newington Green.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we're really excited.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we can't wait.
And part of the campaign described Wollstonecraft as one of history's most neglected icons. Why do you think that is?
Okay, so it's happened through history that women are erased, and we have to sort of find them and bow down to them and understand their legacy in order to frame our own lives, really. I think in Wollstonecraft's particular case, she was this extraordinary 18th century Enlightenment writer, and she did write as a consequence of needing to pay her way. So she was an independent woman. She was from a lower middle class family. She had an abusive father. She had to really sort of support her family, and therefore she had to make money. So Wollstonecraft herself was very, very passionate, and she wrote about the rights of women not being enslaved, not being confined, like birds in a cage, like the feathered race. She wanted women to be emancipated. She was before the vote. She was 100 years before the vote, so some people consider her to be the first suffragette. But at her time, she wanted women to fulfil their own agency. And she also believed very deeply that this was going to impact in a very positive way on male-female relationships and on children and on education of people for the sort of role of civic society, taking responsibility for civic change, taking responsibility for social sort of progressive developments. Wollstonecraft was all about that. So she was very unusual. What happened was that when she died, giving birth to Mary Shelley, unfortunately, which was an absolute tragedy, her husband, who she did marry eventually, was William Godwin, and he was a writer himself, and I mean, he was devastated by Wollstonecraft's death, and within months of her dying, he wrote a memoir, which was unfortunately a sort of bodice ripper. It said all about her passions for women. It said about her relationships out of wedlock, about her kind of position as a single parent, and people just couldn't digest it. They just didn't want to hear about it. And in the 19th century, her book was, I mean, it just stopped being published. So that was the mechanism, that was the strategic way that Wollstonecraft's legacy was erased. And it wasn't really until the sort of mid-60s that Janet Todd found a fragment about Wollstonecraft when she was studying for her PhD in California in an American archive. And she thought, well, this has just got to be developed and researched. So she did. And then, as you'll be familiar with, she wrote one of the first biographies of Mary Wollstonecraft and has continued to sort of champion the legacy of Wollstonecraft. So really, in answer to your question, it's about her feisty, passionate, very, very energetic life. So just about her energy, she was a traveller. She moved across to Paris during the French Revolution, and she was there. You know, she saw the guillotine, and she didn't really waver. She went to Portugal to look after her friend Fanny Blood, just as she was. She lost her friend, in fact, as she was having her first child. So if you think about it, this is not trains. There's no trains. It's horse and cart. It's boats. It's really, really slow. But Wollstonecraft was not deterred. She just went and travelled far and wide.
Continuing on from talking about Wollstonecraft's travels,
yes,
you mentioned France, which she first arrived in 1792.
Yes.
And later Scandinavia in 1795.
Yes.
Obviously, you were saying there's no train, so transport was much different to what we would experience today. But just thinking about it in terms of a woman travelling alone and an incredibly politically tumultuous times,
That's
thinking
right.
about the French Revolution had kicked off, just how unusual was that for a woman to be travelling alone then?
It was exceptional. It was completely exceptional. And when she went to France, she was expecting a baby with Imlay, the American businessman that led her to go to Norway and Sweden looking for his silver. So yes, I mean it was very, very exceptional, and I think it's what gave her global perspective. So she was anti-slavery. She was very cosmopolitan. She had a big perspective, a worldwide, more internationalist perspective. And I think that would have come from her travel and her experience of a wide range of people and her interest. I mean, she's very curious.
Thinking about Wollstonecraft's perspective and how it changed through travel.
Yeah.
Prior to arriving in France, she was quite a supporter of the idea behind the French Revolution.
Yes, that's right.
How do you think actually witnessing it firsthand, and particularly the violence that ensued with the Reign of Terror afterwards, she had friends imprisoned, witnessed executions, do you think that changed her political ideas?
Yes, I do. So she came back, and in fact, Fragments and Monuments has, which is a performance and film company, and we made a film on Newington Green called Vindication, which is it's a fantasy. It's got poetic license, but it is the soiree with Richard Price where Mary Wollstonecraft enters, and they welcome her as Mr. Creswick, which was her nom de plume. So she arrives and she's walked across Newington Green, and at that soiree she meets Tom Paine and William Godwin there. But poor Richard Price had been locked up and really incarcerated in his own home for his anti-monarchist sentiments. So I think it speaks really to our own time now, the level of kind of political dissent and discord, and the kind of the vitality of these dissenters in their protest against what was basically a very strong institution of church, plus the role of the monarchy at that time, which they were absolutely against. And the positioning of Newington Green is outside the city walls, so that's why they had the sort of license, if you like, to be dissenters around Newington Green. There's quite a lot of documentation about the number of Americans that visited Newington Green. So Harvard, the university, was set up initially at Newington Green. Tom Paine, who wrote the American Constitution. So when Wollstonecraft wrote Vindication of the Rights of Men, in our film, there's a little bit of a joke about where did that name, Vindication of the Rights of Women, come from. There's a tussle between her and Paine. But basically this idea about civic responsibility that's not to do with the church was absolutely ingrained. And I think that Wollstonecraft understood that because of her requirement to become an independent wage earner in that family situation. She also became a governess, and so she saw how the other half lived. But the role of the governess also enabled her to go into libraries, for example, in Ireland, in Dublin, and to start studying. So she obviously had an absolute capacity for studying and read very, very widely. And in this way, she created these really kind of moral and philosophical frameworks that provided the template from which the suffrage movement started. And Millicent Fawcett did write the introduction to A Vindication of the Rights of Women when it was republished in the early 1900s as a part of the suffrage publication of important texts.
Coming back to Wollstonecraft's travels, when she went to Scandinavia in 1795.
Yes.
This was just after her first suicide attempt. And it has been said that writing about her travel in her letters and part of the travel itself was a form of therapy for her. What's your opinion on that?
I think it's a really interesting question. So when you look at that travel writing, I mean, it's so passionate and so inquisitive, and she's looking, and she's also an outsider, seeing other people living. And I think she speaks about the family she sees, the people who are running boats, the fishing, and the whole beautiful landscape of Norway and Sweden. But she is travelling with a child. I mean, she's travelling with a child. So you have to ask yourself, I mean, this is an Amazon. I mean, it's an Amazon. And I think that the being in a different place really, really helped her. But what I'd like to emphasise is actually her physical ability to travel and the way that she embodied a sense of agency and a sense of identity. So she's jumping on and off boats, she's got her daughter with her, she's talking to people, she's finding out about a different way of life, and she's recording that and writing it in her letters, keeping up a sort of letter writing practice. And she's looking for silver that's been lost. So it's a good detective. Work that we've done is literally to try and walk in the footsteps of Mary Wollstonecraft and her travel writing. So the work that we've done with taking her legacy from Newington Green has meant that when we first commissioned the play Wollstonecraft Live, it was a film location, and it was to make a biopic of Mary Wollstonecraft's life and work, but it was site-specific performance. So you started in the Unitarian Meeting House, then you walked out onto Newington Green. Now this mobility, this role of the audience walking, talks in its turn to Mary Wollstonecraft, because we're not talking about a passive audience who just sits and receives. We're talking about an investigative audience who really look and really kind of understand the heritage that seeps through Newington Green. So one person who was in our audience said that she could feel the history of Newington Green coming up underneath as she sat on a stack of newspapers to watch this play Wollstonecraft Live unfold. The digitisation of that play was in short films, which then were projected in different places and in different countries and on different websites. But the dresses that we had then were box dresses, which spoke to the teacup shape of an 18th century dress. So it was a critical costume that showed about the representation of femininity and how it can be a burden to try and fit into different kind of frameworks or templates that are expectations of women. So these dresses in the Unitarian Meeting House, they didn't go down the aisles, they wouldn't fit, so the actors had to pull them up, and there was a choreographer, and there was a lot of really interesting play between Wollstonecraft's writing and dress. And most recently we've done a Wollstonecraft walk. So again, everybody is walking around Newington Green to find out about Mary Wollstonecraft's life and legacy. And we've had a lot of feedback from our audience to say that the social aspect of this kind of work, promenade, site-specific, walking theatre, is really great in terms of making people feel a sense of belonging, understanding their own history, local history, meeting new people, and getting to grips with sort of place and space and location, and learning about history, not just through books, but through actually doing it. And I think that's where I would say our work chimes really strongly with Wollstonecraft, because she definitely had a sense of vigour and physicality. I mean, she actually survived 2 suicide attempts, and in her very short life travelled to a number of different places in the world. Plus, she had the time to write one of the most significant volumes of her time. I think in terms of mental health, she found ways to deal with it. I mean, I don't think it's a simple question. I don't know how much has been written about it, but there is definitely significant evidence that, I think I'm right in saying that she took laudanum, and, you know, I mean, she had a really tough time. And I guess we can kind of understand that as a woman who was trying to find her feet in a very, very male-dominated society, and the impact that that had on her. So she got a lot of trolling, she got a lot of people being very, very aggressive about her. And certainly when the memoir was published that Godwin wrote, it didn't take people a minute to write her off. She was called a hyena in petticoats by Walpole. So, I mean, she was obviously a threat, let's put it that way, and that comes at a cost. And I think that that's one of the things that I like most about working with her legacy, is this idea that walking in her footsteps basically is a way of us all finding more healthy ways of being and communicating and understanding what our role is here.
Thinking about her legacy and, like you were saying, her life of emotional turmoil, deep passions.
Yeah.
Some people, I think, struggle to marry that personal life with some of her writing, the incredibly rational philosophies. What's your opinion of that, and how has that affected her legacy?
I think there's a sort of patriarchal kind of expectation that rational is going to be non-emotional. And I think that really we know that that is not the case. And that makes her writing contemporary, because she manages to juggle both sides of the human sort of personality, what makes us human. She juggles both of those. And I think that her writing's really extraordinary in the way that it shows that. I mean, it demonstrates the difficulty. Some of her quotes are very intimate. And she says in her letters to Godwin, for example, "Oh, come and see me after the show tonight and I'll be ready for you," or "Why did you miss me this morning? You went out too quickly," or whatever. And you're kind of going, wow. And I used some of those quotes for my business cards, and I was giving them out to people recently. I thought, oh my God, these are quite, they're really candid, kind of fun. And I think she must have been really an exciting person to have known, and I think that is really intriguing in terms of a woman from the 18th century, and just basically how she balanced a sense of rational enlightenment and very strong sense that personal agency is what it's about, and it's not to do with like taking religious instruction or following in the footsteps of the monarchy. It's about finding your own path, and Wollstonecraft certainly did that.
So, bearing that in mind, what do you think Mary Wollstonecraft would make of society today?
I think she'd be horrified at the pompous nature of it. I think she'd be horrified at the lack of charity in our politicians, the lack of notion about service, the fact that they seem to be out for themselves. And I think that could be on either side of the House of Commons, really. And those in between perhaps have more generosity. I'm not sure. But the devastation, for example, that we're seeing up north at the moment with the floods, and the fact that our Prime Minister can't even consider that to be a national emergency, I think she would find very. I think she'd be appalled, because really we've come so far, and we should be in a much more generous position for sorting out so that everybody has an equal share of the cake, which I think is what she wanted. I mean, she was definitely a person who was for equality. I think in terms of the World Wide Web, she might be very interested in that, because she published her books, and she loved the kind of new innovations in publishing, which at her time in the 1790s were really flourishing. And she could publish parts of her book, a couple of chapters, people would buy it with some cash, and then they'd read it, and then they'd buy the next couple of chapters, and then these would be bound together. So anything to do with communication, she would celebrate and love. But I'm sure that, she'd probably be a victim of the terrible violence against women online, for example. And she wouldn't want that, and it would impact on her mental health. So we come round full circle, really. But I think we just have to agree that she's very, very contemporary. And I think she'd be out there talking and arguing for a better future. I think that's really what she wanted for men and for women.
Yeah, I think she'd definitely be on my dream dinner party list.
Yeah, absolutely.
She'd be fascinating to talk to.
Yeah.
As were you, Anna. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Alan. Lovely to meet you.